Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news and commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. So as usual, I have with me Arslan Khan. How are you, Arslan?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Great. And let's just dive into it. I think the headliner for this past week was a private company in Pakistan, a conglomerate, Alsons Group, I think giving a surprisingly revealing 4 new piston engines that they're manufacturing in Pakistan indigenously, primarily for the use of, I guess, small form factor unmanned aerial systems or UAVs. So they have basically, for now, 4 distinct models. A 120cc version, 170cc, 183cc, and a 280cc. So, not the most powerful and biggest engines right now. However, I think it's a pretty good start. They said that their new in-house, I guess, R&D technology bureau, I don't have the full acronym offhand. Oh, here it is. Yeah, Advanced Kinetic Aerospace Labs was responsible for essentially bringing this together. Obviously, there's probably more at play with that story, but I think the big point is that we are finally seeing some really interesting traction on the propulsion side for drones. That's on, and this is that, and that too with the private sector. And I have some thoughts on that in our next section. But this is running in tandem with also several miniature turbojet projects. I mean, besides the NESCOM one that we keep sort of coming back to, the NTG V1, NASTAP has 2 programs as well called the Lahab or Lahab series. So I think it's like Lahab 20 and Lahab 40 or Lahab 40 and Lahab 80 or whatever the case, but they're basically small form factor turbojet engines for essentially loitering munitions and target drones, basically. So, the Lahab 20 and Lahab 40, there you go. So the point being is that, I just let's get your thoughts on the Alsons Group, and then we can kind of dig into it a bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, so if we just dive deeper into it anyway as a whole, so just as a bit of context in terms of piston engines, to give like a baseline understanding. So the kind of pistons where we see most commonly used, not in UAVs, but just generally in aviation, are your Lycomings, your Continentals, your Rotaxes. These are very, very heavy old lumps designed to hit 2,000-hour TBOs. Something like a Rotax 912, I think has off the top of my head, 2,200-hour TBO. So a TBO being time between overhaul, which is your major inspection. You replace components, whatever, etc. So that's the sort of context behind sort of the typical piston engine. They're designed for reliability, long-term use, whereas the kind of engines we want for UCAVs, obviously cost is a big thing, right? We want low-cost engines, pretty easy to produce and attritable. So with these, then you need to start making a compromise somewhere, right? You can't have a cheap engine that's going to run for thousands and thousands of hours. But the great thing is you don't need it to. Something like these, for example, if you look at, I believe it's Elbit Systems, they have a subsidiary called UAV Engines Limited here in the UK. Some of their engines, I was quite impressed actually. They've got a 50-hour TBO. Now, bear in mind, these are engines that are designed to just be blown up. But, in their first deployment, they're expected to be blown up, right? So, yeah. So the point I'm trying to make here is when it comes to these engines, the key things we look for now when it comes to these UCAV engines is they need to be really easy to produce. They need to be scalable. We need to be able to pump out tons of them, and they need to be cost effective, but also reliable, right? You don't want an engine that's going to fail straight out of the box. You need it to actually make sure that you need to be able to make sure it actually make it to its target. So that's sort of the context behind this. And I think maybe you might have another question.
Yeah. So in that sense, like, what do you think of the AKAL engines? Basically, like I noticed, for example, they have a TBO of about 300 hours, so they're not as, I would say, disposable per se. I think there is like a dual role purpose to these. Like they might double as small form factor reconnaissance drone applications as well, target drones and that kind of stuff, maybe recoverable applications. So it's not entirely meant to be disposable, but it looks like, it's still just 300 hours for TBO. So it's still quite on the short side anyway. So I think there is an eye here for loitering munitions.
Yeah, I mean, these are 100% designed for loitering munitions. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to piss on everyone's parade here a little bit, as these are most likely a design that's been designed by somebody else and has been licensed by Alsons, which again isn't a bad thing, right? People seem to have this impression that if it's not made 100% nut bolt and designed by a Pakistani, that it's a bad thing. No, because why reinvent the wheel, right? Why pour tons and tons of money into research and development and all this sort of stuff when you're going to get the same output anyway? The Chinese have been making these engines for God knows how long, and they basically make them for everyone, which is the reality. So why go ahead and reinvent the wheel? And there's a couple of things that make me that sort of point towards this. Is if you do end up taking some time out after this episode to look up the data sheets on the website, you'll see there's a lot of inconsistency between each data sheet in terms of the kind of the kind of data they give you, which kind of points to me that they're just pulling the data from another manufacturer. And this obviously isn't the first time this has happened, right? We had Solinux, which is another company in Pakistan, and this is a company that's actually quite well, how do I say, it's in the right places, right? And they've been doing a lot of stuff for the armed forces for a while. They make a lot of pneumatic launchers, and actually they export them as well. I believe they exported some to Spain this recently as well. And they've got turbojets, right? Sorry, gas turbines and whatnot. So they've got a series, the SLX series is what they call them. And now, unfortunately, obviously they've gone ahead and presented them as if they're their own design, and actually they make a big thing about research and development about of engines and whatnot, simulation driven, precision engineering, reliability, full support, blah blah blah. But the reality is these are actually just Swiwin turbines that have been that they've just slapped their logo on, and Swiwin is a Chinese OEM. They make RC aircraft engines, and actually their engines are being used on cruise missiles now as well, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So basically, I don't really think this is as big of a thing as people are making it out to be, other than the most important thing I take away from this is the kind of atmosphere within Pakistan is shifting, right? There is clearly a demand that these players are now starting to license engine designs and bring them into Pakistan to be able to produce them. So that clearly shows there's a demand, right? And so back to the actual engines themselves, like these are very decent looking engines based off of the data sheet. The smallest engine you've got there is a 2.5-kilo engine, if I'm reading the but when you add everything on, you're probably talking about 3 kilos engine, producing 12.5 horsepower. That's pretty solid, and they've got a few kind of in class as well. You've got a 10 11 horsepower 5-kilo engine. So I mean, I don't really understand the sort of these sorts of overlaps, but there'll be a logic behind it, I'm sure. But the point is these are reasonably competitive offerings. Like there's nothing in here that I would go ahead and say, okay, this is subpar or whatever. Like all of these seem to be pretty competitive, and they do just fine for the mission. So whether it's green through and through, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And actually, it's probably quite beneficial that these are built off of a proven existing design, because it just means they're cheaper and easier to produce, right? All of the niggles and all of the hiccups have been worked out, and they've got scale to work with, So actually, I think this is quite a good development. Is it what they're claiming? No. Has AKAL gone and developed these engines? Probably not. These are, I'm willing to bet anything that these are an imported design. But again, imports aren't always a bad thing. And in this case, I'd probably argue that this is probably the best solution. And again, this won't be the only solution for what it's worth. Obviously, if Alsons have seen this gap, others will have too, and maybe somebody will end up building something from scratch, but we'll see what's to come.
Yeah, I agree. There's certain things, certain inputs that if you can get the actual designs for them, the CNCs and all that stuff off the shelf, just go for it. And that's especially the case for the private sector. I think in this context, same with Solinux as well. To be fair to them, the private sector does not have an infinite number or infinite pool of resources like the state seems to have, right? They just can't tap into the Pakistani taxpayer base and just start extracting from there. They have to operate with their, operating. They have to basically operate with the fiscals they have in hand. They run on profit and loss P&Ls. So basically, the point being is that they have to make the most pragmatic, quick, fastest to market decision. I don't think Alsons Group, Solinux, and any of these companies have that much fiscal bandwidth to just, invest in R&D without state support. And then we know when it comes to state support, the state prefers its own in-house entities like NESCOM, NASTAP, and what have you. So in that sense, it's a good sign that at the bare minimum, we're starting to see these companies at least set up that production capacity outside of the state, right? Traditionally, what we would have seen, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago, is that PAC would have picked up whatever, these designs are and started manufacturing them at PSC. And then suddenly you just have this massive overhead that would probably hang on. They would have to hang on to for many years, and then we would ask, like we do about, for example, POF, Pakistan Ordnance Factories, like why do they keep producing the G3 and nothing else? It's the same issue, right? So I feel like the bare minimum here, like Alsons Group, probably being a private company, they have a long-term plan. So right now they are probably entering the market pretty quickly with these off-the-shelf designs, and then maybe down the line, if they get those massive domestic orders, if they can get exports off the ground, once those profits start coming in, they'll start reinvesting potentially in some applications and designs that are much more future leaning and things that you just can't easily get off the market. That's typically how these things work. So, and that goes to our next bigger topic, is that, and I think it's like like a dual track topic. So the first is that, at one level, we're seeing the Pakistani military really start to engage the private sector a bit more seriously. And they're engaging the private sector in particular in the areas of loitering munitions and small drones. So that's two items here. One is that the Pakistani military is investing big time in loitering munitions. I think they have made loitering munitions a very key central part of their warfighting strategy. I think it's probably going to be a big line item in the procurement budget. And by engaging the private sector and getting the private sector to take on more of the manufacturing in Pakistan, especially for like the propulsion, the materials for those loitering munitions and what have you, like as many of the components that you can realistically build at scale domestically, you can lower the costs down dramatically because you're now drawing on the rupee and the Pakistani labor market as opposed to overseas dynamics. And with that, you get very low cost loitering munitions, which would be relatively capable for what they cost. And then the budgetary increases we see in the defense budget, where you're cranking it up to 3 trillion rupees, that increase is you're gonna get your mileage from that increase is going to be much longer from by acquiring locally made loitering munitions and many other options. So with that, I think this is a pretty interesting sign of where things are going. What do you think, Arslan?
Yeah, so as you said, it seems a lot like the Pakistan Armed Forces are really roping in the private sector here. And as I said, this sort of ties back to the previous point you were talking about. Is obviously there's clearly a demand here. That's why they've gone and done this, right? When it comes to these UAVs, and actually, I intend to put out an article about this at some point as well. Is we see in Ukraine, for example, they're producing 10 to 20,000 different types of drones a day, which is an insane number, right? And if Pakistan expects a Ukraine-type war, which the Pakistan army particularly has been modeling a lot of its procurements and a lot of things based off of what we've seen from Ukraine. Like we see the Pakistan army is like disproportionately investing in FPV drones, for example. And so again, the 10,000 number or 20,000 number is a significant amount that will be made up by easy, low, cheap drones like FPVs. But obviously, a big part of that will also be made up of these long-range strategic loitering munitions as well. And again, this is something that all three branches are heavily, heavily investing in. The Air Force has effectively gone and built its own sort of artillery force via the inductions of these loitering munitions. So, as you said, it seems it's pretty clear here that the armed forces are going quite heavily in on these systems, and the private, it's not something that can it'd be supported entirely by the state and like funds, right? Because obviously they also have bigger fish to fry, right? We've got the rocket force, for example, now, which is a big thing, and they're buying a ton of missiles, for example. And so we're a country with limited resources and limited facilities, but even then, we've seen, like in the last year, like I've probably seen nearly 10 different facilities pop up specifically designed for the production of loitering munitions. And not only are some local, you've got some international players as well, like some Chinese firms setting up entire production lines in Pakistan, or Turkish firms, or even domestic ones like Wootech, or I'm sure even Solinux. There's so many companies. Basically, everyone and their mother has designs for loitering munitions in Pakistan. You're talking Cavalier, you're talking Solinux, and Stingray. There's so many different companies in Pakistan. It's actually quite. You'd be surprised if you looked into it as the audience, but there's so many companies and they've all got designs, right? It's just a case of being able to produce them at scale. And this is what I want to really highlight: is if Pakistan is expecting a Ukraine type war, they're going to need to do stuff like this, where they're going to need to distribute orders and designs among different companies, right? For example, in Ukraine, you've got Firepoint, you've got all these other companies, right? So it's not just one entity producing these systems. Whereas in Pakistan, if it was a typical if we're talking like 10, 15 years ago, as you said, Pakistan Aeronautical Complex or Air Weapons Complex would just be producing them alone. And again, how many can you produce out of one factory, out of one company, out of one plant, right? Not enough is the answer. So at this point, it's kind of going to have to be a case of where the Pakistan Armed Forces are going to have a very diverse drone inventory, and as a result of that, we're going to see more designs and we're going to see more players pop up, because they're going to need to distribute these orders to be able to hit the kind of numbers, for example, the Ukrainians are hitting. But 10 to 20,000 a day is an insane number. Now, as I said, not all of them are these really, really high-end complex UAVs. A lot of them will be small FPVs, but even that is, if you think about it, that's an insane number, because these small FPVs have the same effect as something like ATGM, for example. You're not going to find many places producing 10,000 ATGMs a day, I can tell you that. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of mixing of dynamics happening here, which we sort of frame this as from the perspective of the Pakistan military driving a lot of the procurement, and that is true. And in that context, you also see some older state-owned enterprises get in on the design front. So one good example is the Internal R&D Bureau, ARDIC, of Heavy Industries Taxila. So they have begun their own internal, UAV related R&D work. But the way ARDIC typically works is that they don't manufacture the thing that they design all the time. Sometimes they actually license the design out to external private sector players to go and make. They just take on the initial R&D overhead itself and then give the design to them. So that's very common with like the inputs that they've designed and indigenized for the Heather MBT, for the Heather main battle tank, or the howitzer program and what have you. So that's one aspect. And then you have some loitering munition or maybe broader drone projects happening in NRTC as well. So they've begun hiring people. But then you have Bekar Pakistan, which is also going on a hiring spree for who knows what purposes. It might be related to loitering munitions. It might, as we hope, be related to a loyal wingman. However, I think when you start bringing the Chinese into the picture, and don't worry, folks, there's not an anti-China rant happening here. But I feel that there might be a situation where many of these other countries like China, Turkey, maybe possibly even Western countries we don't even know about yet, they're looking at the fact that Pakistan has a very low labor cost, has a very cheap currency, and these drones are not that complicated to make. So I'm wondering if also there is an internal dynamic here, because the fact is, Alsons Group was able to get the stack to manufacture piston engines from somewhere, and that somewhere had to agree to sell the stack. Right, there has to be some incentive factor here, maybe some strategic incentive as well. So if they went out from, let's say, they have some MOUs in the works, or they've been drawing interest from a Eurosatory, which is where they reveal these engines, by the way, from like European industrial companies. So let's say they got it from Europe, right? For example, I wonder if there is a sense that these other militaries are saying, hey, like, why don't we start loading in some of that production capacity for these super cheap mass scale drones in a place like Pakistan, right? So because everybody has the same requirement. Everyone needs large numbers of these drones. They want to amass a massive number of them, and not just for the attack purpose, but also for the interceptor purpose. And we know from that screenshot, there's like a dozen different random, broadly similar looking, but again, you can tell there's like a lot of random stuff happening with the interceptor line as well, which is probably going to materialize too. So I think there's that dynamic as well, where you're seeing countries just say, hey, like Pakistan looks like it has a lot of unused technical labor and capacity. They have these industrial companies which have sort of been kind of limited by design, by the system there. Let's start to see if we can unlock a little bit of this. So I wonder if that's also playing into this. And we could potentially see, it wouldn't surprise me if besides Alsons Group, another company or two other companies come out and start saying that they're manufacturing not just the piston engine line, maybe even someone might go out there and try to license an electric fan design for like the smaller drones as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is, right, is it's probably already happening and we just don't know about it, because it's actually quite out of character for somebody like Alsons or just generally in the Pakistani space for a company to come out and publicly unveil this sort of stuff, because their main customer is the Pakistani armed forces anyway, not export markets. And I think possibly with Alsons coming here to Eurosatory and sort of unveiling it there, it might more to be a push towards Ukraine, because we know Pakistan-Ukraine collaboration has been a thing, right? Particularly in this war, and at the end of the day, these private companies are driven by profit. So if they can nag a deal, right, if they can get a deal somewhere, that's all they care about. You raise an interesting point about other countries offloading some work, and actually China is a good example. I wasn't going to talk about this, but there are multiple examples of countries where the Chinese are not really seen in a very favorable light after, for whatever reason, right? There might have been some reason, they might have done something, but no, I'm not going to make any, I'm not going to make any assertions. But certain countries,
I can see a lot of side eyes pointing
yeah,
towards you right now. Like
yeah,
one such country is a forum, a certain thread, I imagine.
yeah. So there are certain countries where certain Chinese companies aren't viewed very favorably, and they aren't really they're not really too keen on doing that. Basically, the countries aren't really happy with them doing business there. And you can sit here and be upset about me saying that, but this is directly from the horse's mouth, right? And if you do enough digging, you can find out some amazing examples of this right in front of you. So there are some countries where the Chinese are basically in effect barred, or certain companies are basically in effect barred. But you know who's not? Pakistan. And you know who has a pretty warm, open, welcoming attitude towards Chinese investment and companies? Pakistan. So what we also tend to see now is a lot of random defense firms opening up in Pakistan, which ran and led by Chinese. It's not because the Chinese have decided, suddenly that they've got this amazing love for Pakistan and they want to live here the rest of their life, but it's actually kind of a proxy for selling their own products via Pakistan in markets where they can't sell under their own name. So there is that sort of, I mean, it's not exactly what you suggested, but it's kind of like 50-50. And they are producing in Pakistan as well. There's a company, I think, actually I won't name. I'll leave names out of this, but so it's not, it's something that's started to happen now, actually in quite big numbers. So yeah, basically we're starting to see a lot of these like random companies in Pakistan that have come out with like crazy designs that you'd never expect from them. But the reality is they're more than likely white labeled Chinese systems that are being built in Pakistan to export to third countries, not even for use in the Pakistan armed forces, but mainly for export to third countries. So yeah, that is a sort of thing, really.
If I had to throw a policy recommendation, whether you're a state-owned corporation, like let's say, POF, or let's say you're a, weird hybrid conglomerate like Quwa Industries Limited, or you're the private sector, please get into fiber optic production if
Yes,
however possible, because
absolutely.
that is going to be like very similar to solid rocket fuel. It's going to be the big in-demand commodity. Granted, I'll be frank, I don't know the supply chain dynamics of fiber optics right now, but the point being is that somehow get yourself into that and be a producer of fiber optics, because
Yeah.
unless you get that under control, then the other stuff is going to falter down the line as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that we kind of like in Pakistan, we kind of look to do the whole a good example is all these like fighter jet programs or whatever. We kind of look to the biggest and most important and the baddest thing, right? Like, oh damn, we need to build our own fighter jet. But I personally believe that instead of trying to do all of these things, how about let's become really, really good at one thing? And the Israelis are a great example of this, right? Like the Israelis, make great radars, great electronic warfare systems, stuff like that. The Israelis have locked in on their sort of military electronics industry, and they've got other great kit as well, like TAMs and all that sort of stuff. But the Israelis, you don't see them saying, okay, look, we're going to produce a fighter jet today, we're going to produce a helicopter tomorrow, we're going to produce a housing society the next day. They're very locked in on one thing, right, which is their electronics, and so there were some other bits and bobs. But I always say this with bystanders: let's focus on the one or two key things that we need for everything. Fiber optics, for example, are a great example. We're going to need them for all our FPVs. We can't rely on imports for this sort of stuff. And when it comes to wartime, we're not going to have access to these imports very easily. Airfields are going to get hit, trains are going to get hit, infrastructure is going to get hit. So we really need to be able to build the stuff at home, particularly stuff like FPVs, which are heavily reliant on fiber optics anyway. So yeah, like I always say, let's become very good at one thing, or let's build up on the inputs that we can't necessarily import, like these little RC electric motors, right? Like stuff like that. Which again, these are inputs that we're going to burn through. If we're modeling our conflict with India based off of Ukraine, or even a tenth of what Ukraine is producing daily, we're looking at a minimum of 2,000 drones a day. Maybe 1,800 of them will be FPVs. But hey, how many? Let's say even 50% of those are fiber optic guided, right? We need to be able to have enough kit to be able to produce 900 of them a day. We're probably going to burn through a lot more of that in a hot conflict. So the point is we really need to be able to start looking away from stuff like PFX and all these fancy things, and maybe let's look at the sort of unattractive stuff like these RC hobbyist motors, or fiber optics. Let's ditch the fancy like PR videos and all that stuff. You can't necessarily I guess it doesn't look the best, when they're talking one PR video is a fighter jet, we're making this next generation fighter jet, blah blah blah, and the next PR video is we've built an RC electric motor. So but the point is let's move away from the sexy stuff and look at the unsexy stuff, like these kind of things, which are going to burn through so many of when it comes to conflict time.
I agree. And the big point is that if you get both the public and private sector individually, investing in these upstream inputs, especially when you have the currency and labor cost advantage. Like, for example, you can take the petrochemical industry. Obviously, we don't have the petro side of it, but if we integrate well enough with the Saudis, the Qataris, the Iranians potentially, now that they're looking to get the sanctions relief and stuff, you come in with the currency and labor cost advantage, because these natural resource exporters, they are obviously, their currencies are in high demand. So for them to get into like the scale intensive manufacturing stuff, it can get expensive for them down the line, right? So if you integrate with them and push that up downstream development or downstream production work for like the plastics and all that kind of stuff into Pakistan, that's what's going to bring in the hard currency. That's what's going to drive exports. That's what's going to give you good jobs and broaden the tax base as well. And then you can start affording those fancy, the fancy kit, right? Like the stealth fighters, the attack helicopters and whatnot. That's how these dynamics work. So the point being is that, get into fiber optics, expand our solid fuel production base as well. That's going to go, I think that the demand for that is going to go up as well, given the state and trajectory of, the Pakistan military's munitions procurement needs, plastics, RC motors and all that kind of stuff. Huge potential. And another point I want to add, just to sort of wrap up this section here, is that as we see more and more production facilities for these loitering munitions and other applications, I think it would be also prudent to maybe distribute them further into the interior, very similar to what Ukraine has done. It might not be possible for the most complex manufacturing work, but at least like, downstream assembly and what have you, if we can get like cobble shops together, with, as what we affectionately call the organic CNC systems, aka people's hands and stuff. If we can get that distributed into the rural areas and stuff, that's going to also help as well, especially if they're closer to the deployment units. I think that's what Ukraine has mastered as well, is where now they've reached a point where their actual frontline units are the direct buyers, and they just literally drive 5 minutes up to the cobble factory to pick up their drones basically and decide what they need and what have you. So that's the level of distribution and dissemination you have to sort of maintain in order to get the strategy going. And sometimes we kind of joke around a little bit saying that, hey, that it seems as if there's like a Ukrainian advisor in Pakistan sort of guiding them towards this. And more we're starting to see signs that seem to indicate that there is a bit of an intentional adoption of how Ukraine in particular has been employing drones, basically. Yeah. So the next topic. So this is not directly Pakistan related, but we're going to take it there because it actually offers some interesting ideas. So recently, last week, MBDA, the European French-led consortium, they test fired the crossbow and what they call it the heavy one-way effector. Now, in NBDA's parlance, one-way effector basically means like this low-cost, low-complexity, long-range strike weapon. So they have these smaller one-way effector designs like the Belush, which is very similar to the Jiran, the Russian Jiran 3, or the jet-powered Shahid variant, or even like Pakistan's, Wutek's High Mark 25 TJ and the NESCOM Delta Baz. So, that's like your smaller, low-cost jet-powered loitering munition. But then they revealed this thing called the crossbow. And, on first glance, if you just, look at the specifications and just look at it very briefly, it might remind you of the Fatah 4. But then when you start digging into it, you notice that the crossbow has some interesting design attributes. Like, for example, the actual turbojet engine, they've actually mounted it out like on top of the airframe. Like, it's literally not inside the airframe. It's been sort of mounted externally, and in return, you don't see the airframe itself have like an air breathing component or anything. And I find that to be very interesting. And then you have obviously like the fixed wing stabilizers as well. And at the aft, you have the rocket assisted takeoff motor. So it seems like they've really they approached this cruise missile with the mentality of making it as simple to build and as low cost to build as possible. To the extent that like even the turbojet, I'm not like, I'd be interested to know like if there's like a plan to make a rocket only variant of this, if it's even possible. But the point being is that if you look at the Fatah 4 and the Harba, you notice that the turbojet's integrated within the airframe. It requires the air intake and what have you. They might have like a a flight control system, a more complex flight control system, whereas this thing seems to be much simpler in design. And I think this is sort of beginning to steer into the territory. And we kind of, if last year we were writing about having jet powered Shahids as like a thing in the Pakistan military, which now seem to be materializing, then it seems like this upcoming year the big call is going to be, we need these low cost, super simple to build cruise missiles. Because if you look at the MBDA Crossbow, it can carry a warhead of about 300 kilograms. Again, ostensibly similar to the Fatah 4, to a range of about 800 kilometers. So very similar in performance and specifications to the Fatah 4, but I imagine designed to be much cheaper. And I think, Arslan, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because you've also labeled a few other of these like low-cost cruise missile concepts.
Actually, firstly, I just want to point out something interesting. Is the Crossbow is quite similar to the Iranian Fibre missile, which is basically just the same thing as this, which is like a long sewer pipe with wings and then an engine stuck up the top. And actually, funnily enough, it's the same engine being used on both as well. The MBDA guys, they've obviously got the original version of the PBS TJ100 from PBS Volkobytes, which is a Czech company, and then the Iranians, they use an unlicensed copy of the exact same engine. So actually, there's a little bit of similarity there as well. The Iranian version, it's a family of the Somar cruise missile, and it's and that's the Russian derived design, where you have the engine also outside of the airframe. And this thing has a range of 1,700 kilometers as well. So they're both quite similar in their performance, based off of what we know. But yeah, so like obviously these are clearly designed to be low cost, right? Like, you've got no fancy intake. You don't have to worry about like fancy intake geometry and all this sort of stuff. You don't have to worry about. They're clearly not necessarily designed to be the most stealthiest things in the world, and they're clearly designed to be easy to produce. Like that's the key thing here. Forget everything I've just said. They're clearly designed to be easy to produce. You've got the body, you've got the wings, and you've got the engine that just, in effect, just sticks on, right? They're designed to clearly be easy to produce and cost effective. And I think the idea behind the Crossbow series, and actually I was looking at this the other day, is there was 3 designs. This was a part of a British competition for missile, basically cruise missiles for Ukraine. I mean, there were 3 options, and the MBDA Crossbow was one of them. And if my memory isn't failing me here, it was like the cost had to be under £250,000, for example. So that's sort of the idea, is it's meant to be really easy to produce, and which again is kind of backed up by the fact that it's really intended to get sent over to Ukraine. Easy to produce, cheap to produce, and scalable. £250,000 is obviously a lot, but when we're talking about cruise missiles, it's literally nothing. The Russians, their imported Shahids were not much less than that, but obviously you've got a far greater payload here. You've got far greater, actually you probably don't have greater range, but you've got far, you've got good payload. These are obviously designed to penetrate. These are obviously designed to penetrate, air defenses and attack on infrastructure and whatnot. So, this is sort of the idea behind this. And the examples I have listed are actually, again, the first one is obviously the Rusty Dagger, which is the AGM 188. And what that is basically a really, really low cost cruise missile. I believe it was originally designed specifically for the Ukrainians, or something along those lines. And it's basically a 225 kilo missile powered by a turbojet, and has a range, I believe it was 450 kilometers, something like that. So it's basically designed as a long range strike weapon. However, its sort of competition here is, a missile like the powered JDAM, right? And so it's meant to be like a hybrid between a cruise missile and a glide bomb. And so you basically strip down all of the other fancy bits, right? You take it down into its simplest form, and that's what you've built here. And I think that the PJDAM is a pretty good example of this, and it's probably a little bit easier to talk about because there's a lot more information about it. But for example, the powered JDAM basically gives you up to 500-pound payload, and it gives you a range of either 300 nautical miles, which should be, I think, basically 300 nautical miles with a 500-pound warhead. And obviously you've got the ability to have an onboard seeker, data link, or other mission avionics. And it's basically capable to be fitted to any aircraft that already is integrated with JDAMs, and it allows you to so it basically gives you the opportunity to strike far deeper for far cheaper, right? Everything, the warhead bit is all mass produced. There's no integration costs or anything. It's using an engine that's widely produced and widely used once again. So your key here is just trying to reduce the amount of new development needed, right, to be able to really kill those costs. So that's sort of the story behind the PJDAM and the Rusty Dagger. And there's another even better example, which is the S8000 Banderol, which is a Russian cruise missile that's been seen in Ukraine, and it's a really really small cruise missile, and it's designed around the Swiwin S800 Pro, which is a RC engine, right? And that I believe you can get them for, they publicly listed for about $15,000 each. So, God knows what the Russians are paying, but I can guarantee it's a lot less than that, right? And they're really as simple as it gets when it comes to sort of cruise missile design, right? You've got no fancy seekers, you've got a GPS antenna that are designed to be, resistant to countermeasures. So you've got, interference-proof GPS antennas. You've got none of the sort of fancy stuff you see in cruise, no Tercom, no crazy seekers or anything. It's a very simple missile. It's a fuel tank, couple of circuit boards, an engine, and a warhead, which is what more do you need, So that's the sort of idea behind the S800. And again, the most expensive part of this missile is likely the engine. And as I said, the engine's about publicly is $16,000 to $20,000. Behind closed doors, with the kind of scale the Russians are ordering at, who knows, they might be even getting those engines at, a sub $10,000 per unit cost, or even they might even be producing them themselves for cheaper. So the point is you can really get your costs down if you kind of just take it all the way back down to the bare minimum. What at the end of the day, the question comes down to, what do you need out of this missile? What do you need out of this design? The idea and in the Russian and Ukrainian philosophy is we need to be able to deliver a warhead effectively, and that's it really. And obviously there'll be a cost to benefit and a trade-off and whatnot, between fancy electronics and seeker options and whatnot versus cost. But clearly the cost, the ratio isn't big enough for them to go ahead and design these around big expensive seekers and countermeasures and all that sort of system. So it's really a case of, the thing that's really winning here is low cost, attritable, and easy to produce, which is again what I've been saying the entire time, is low cost, attritable, easy to produce. The Banderol is a very simple missile. You've got no fancy airframe. It's designed to be easy to produce. It's designed around commercial components that they can access really easily without sanctions, and components that are low cost. And this is and this kind of ties into Pakistan and actually I would argue there's a pretty good sort of baseline already that exists, right, which is the Uzab 81LR, which obviously, when I say exists, it's been conceptualized, right, which is basically a small diameter bomb equivalent, but powered with an engine, right? And it's got a range of 120 kilometers plus, because depending on launch altitude, right? They use an IRR seeker with a 3-meter CEP. So this seems like a pretty good baseline, right? You've got the airframe, you've got the engine, you've got the warhead, which is probably going to be just a warhead a bomb that they already produce anyway, encapsulated. You've got the seeker. Now let's work backwards here. We don't need the seeker. We can make it low cost. We can rely on GPS guidance only, for example. So we can get rid of the seeker, which is probably going to be one of the biggest costs here. We can see what the situation with the engine is. If we need to substitute it for something cheaper, we can do. And basically, we'll just strip it down to its bare minimum. What do we need to get an effector on site and to be able to cause the damage we need to? So I think that's sort of what also the philosophy, the general direction that the philosophy is going into anyway, is let's have one common platform and let's have multiple derivatives of it. And I assume a part of that derivative is naturally going to be what's the cheapest way we can get a munition on target. And I don't know if my memory is playing with me here or not, but if I recall, there was also a turbojet powered Uzab series. That's not the 81. And again, that's kind of, what's a cruise missile, right? It's a warhead, it's an engine, some wings, and it flies to its target. In its most fundamental form, something like a powered JDAM is a cruise missile. There's no distinction, right? But it's the most basic form of a cruise missile in the sense where it's going to get a warhead on target. And I think that's kind of the conversation we need to start having, is instead of, and I think that's what sort of is already happening anyway via the rocket force, right? It's almost guaranteed that the Fatah 4, for example, ditches a lot of the Tercom and the DS-Max sensors that were seen on the Babur series. Same goes for the Temur. So, it's kind of like already happening, right? They're looking at these now from a mass production angle, which is obviously a great thing, because we've always had the question mark, like, are these missiles and are these systems actually being produced in big numbers? And now it's clear that, yeah, they are. If we look at how many tests have just occurred this year, they wouldn't be able to do these unless they were able to produce them in big enough numbers. So, but we need to really start having the conversation about what's the most fundamental form we can get our cruise missiles and our effectors down to, and how much and how easy they'd be to build. And again, even if we don't look at the Uzab as the sort of baseline, we also have the Rasub as well, which could be another amazing example, or even the Khaem V3, right? That's the building blocks are here, right? It's now purely a case of willpower and a bit of thinking like, oh, okay, is this what we really need, or what's the bare minimum we need to be able to get a missile on target, and for at a budget that's affordable to us, but also an effectiveness that's acceptable to us.
Absolutely. I think this is really, I have a theory that it might be partially unintentional because a lot of these Pakistani projects predate the Ukraine war. But now that they're seeing how these types of weapon systems are faring in Ukraine, they're getting that test data and perspective, like that real world driven perspective, because the Ukraine war and now even the US, Iran, Israel, these like recent wars, you never had this much real world, like large scale conflict studies available, right? To this scale, especially between two different states or between states, basically, like state on state warfare. So you suddenly have this massive infusion of information and knowledge, and you have a lot more companies and people working on this stuff, so you start getting these innovative ideas. So in relation to what you said, I think already the Fatah 4, as you said, strips down a lot of the complex aspects of both the Babur and the Harba. I mean, I think if you look at the photo the model they released in the August 14th show last year, it seems to have like a fixed wing architecture, like unlike the Babur to my recollection. So already they've begun simplifying it. And I think it is plausible that if, for example, they find that going towards the crossbow or the Babur route, that by just completely omitting the integrated turbojet and just having that integrated outside the airframe and use a much simpler cylindrical design, that could be the long-term way. Like it might not be called Fatah 4, it might be called something else, but the point being is that that's already, like, here, I'll put it this way. Like, if you look at the Sarfarosh, loitering-munition cruise missile project, it's a much smaller one, but it has like a range of 1,000 kilometers, again, turbojet powered. It follows a very similar philosophy to the crossbow. It's just a smaller application. So it's a question of if they can scale that up. And obviously, I think they can, because these designs are, by their nature, meant to be cost-effective and simple to make. And I really like it you raised Khaem V3 as an example as well, because it already has that small stealthy airframe quality. It's just a question again of scaling it up a little bit further so that it can handle a bigger warhead, essentially. And again, a lot of the understanding and capacity to do that already exists. Is actually like a question of stripping things back and getting to that lower cost. So like compared to Timur, which has it has a complex flight control system, relatively speaking, but with the Khaem V3, and it is a PF/BCAR project. But I think if they keep going in that direction, you could potentially see like a Pakistan equivalent or Pakistan analogous counterpart to the Rusty Dagger. You can see a Pakistan analogous counterpart to the crossbow. You can see a Pakistan, obviously with the Uzab 83 turbojet, that's the one that you mentioned. Again, we have a Pakistani analogous equivalent to the powered JDAM. So already the Pakistani industry, both it's the state-owned ones anyways, they're already trending along these lines, right? It's just now you need those decision makers to really push this through and get it to the end, and so we can build essentially the in-depth arsenal of these munitions, both from a surface to surface, but also now air to surface, which is the other dynamic here. Like I think the dream scenario would be that you'd be able to use our existing JS-17 Block 1s and basically quickly, connect them with these, let's call them Khaem V30s, like the bigger versions, and then and the powered Uzabs and what have you, and just use them as essentially standoff weapon carriers, right? So I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff here in Pakistan that it's really interesting to see like the industry, so like our industry coalesce with where the outside industry is going. So definitely it's like a space worth watching, which is a big reason why we brought up these examples, because I kind of hope that they're like listening to us and sort of emulating what we're doing, because I remember like about a year ago we started talking about the jet powered Shahid style drones, and that Pakistan unintentionally seems to be working towards that, but it didn't have a cohesive strategy. But now it does seem to have a cohesive strategy. So anyway, Arslan, I know you're tapping out here. It's late in the UK, so thank you for joining me, and I'll proceed with the audience questions.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I will see you next week.
All right.
Bye.
See you again. Take care. So Now on to the final segment. It's just myself. So we're going to do the solo cast audience Q&A. So the first one came through email from Farhan. So the question is, given Pakistan's current industrial base, how fast can the Pakistan Army induct and achieve the operational readiness of unmanned ground vehicles or robotic ground vehicles? And will these systems be tailored differently for the Western insurgency versus the conventional Eastern Front? So there's definitely context to this question because the NRTC has been developing the Heather UGV. So basically that's their flagship Indigenous UGV, the let's call it the HEK, just for shortening it. Let's just call it the Heather. I mean, not to be confused with the Heather tank, main battle tank, but let's just call it like little Heather, mini Heather or something. But anyways, like it resembles a small combat tank. It carries a 7.62 millimeter remote weapon station. It's controlled from a ground station about 8 kilometers out through a line of sight radio. And what's interesting is that according to NRTC, it's been developed by a pretty small team. So I think it was like a bit of an internal skunk works on their part, and they're able to push it through. But right now, it's going through testing. They said that they do anticipate serial production, but it's unclear if the Army is moving towards this yet. Now, I just want to highlight that, a lot of the UGV experiences coming out right now is from Ukraine. And there's a very crucial context we have to keep in mind with Ukraine that might not apply with Pakistan. And the thing is that for Ukraine, UGVs have been like a pretty crucial piece in substituting manpower because they do have a manpower shortage. They're really trying to balance out how many other people they can commit for engineering, production, and the industrial side, and how many they can have available for frontline fighting. Right. So with that in mind, you'll notice that a lot of the big pushes towards automation, AI, autonomous drone warfare, all that kind of autonomized, roboticized war fighting is happening in Ukraine for a very specific reason. Is because for them, human resources is it's a scarce commodity, right? Not to put it so tritely, but I mean, let's put it in terms of paper. It's not something that they can just easily tap into for war fighting. So they have to substitute that with machines. That being said, I think with the Pakistan Army, it's tough to anticipate them to deploy these in large numbers, anyways, because again, they don't have the urgency because they have they're, to put it another way, they're human resource rich in a weird way. So they'll never have a shortage of soldiers who they can recruit to drive infantry operations. So again, that's a huge, if you were to draw an analogous or a parallel to Ukraine, that's a huge aspect that you just take out of the equation there, right? Meaning that the UGV deployment is going to be relatively small scale in Pakistan's context, but it will occur. And I think it could happen within I would say within 3 years in some capacity. So where it's going to matter is in the context of the Pakistan Army is in terms of a low profile, low visibility footprint. This is where you would deploy them for reconnaissance near or across the border, potentially disabling or maybe trying to expose minefield or mine activity on the ground, maybe operate as a bit of like a first responder, but that's going to require some other mechanisms. Now, taking all of this into perspective, I want to draw one point which is really interesting. If you look at who is developing the Heather UGV, it's not heavy industry Texela, right? It's not your traditional large scale vehicle manufacturer. The one designing it is the NRTC. Now, what is the NRTC, right? Well, the National Radio and Telecommunications Corporation. So in the defense space, a lot of their work has been related to or has been driven in areas like networking, data linking, information sharing, the whole, Pakistan's broader network enabled warfare stack. The NRTC played a central role in developing that, right? The civil security infrastructure that they have, from CCTVs and that kind of stuff. That is something the NRTC has been working on. So the fact that the NRTC has, not just from the Heather project, but they have a pretty relatively broad and robust robotics arm, so to speak. And I think that's interesting because if you notice, robotics and autonomous warfare is it has to work hand in hand with the broader autonomous warfare and network enabled stack, right? For example, even if you look at Ukraine, one reason why it works in Ukraine is that, when there's enemy activity or something going on, you have these multiple sensor nodes. So you have your drones, you have your human intelligence, you have a mast mounted, turret mounted electro-optical sensor somewhere. And all these systems are picking up the activity, right? And they're sending that data back to a battlefield management system like Delta, which then parses and organizes that data and then redisseminates it to, your battlefield commanders who then send it out to the firing units. And it seems that, that information goes straight into like a fire control system in some cases. So the best entity in Pakistan who can enable all that to happen or the two entities would be NESCOM and NRTC, right? And I don't know to what extent they are siloed or whether they collaborate is unclear to me because for example, the Pakistan Navy's data link architecture, Link Green, it was co-developed with a Turkish company, Milsoft, but it was done with NESCOM from my understanding. Whereas, the PAF's Link 17 architecture, from my understanding, was developed with NRTC. So I don't know to what extent all these entities cooperate in the data link, or whether they do or do not, because that's secret basically. However, the point being is that the NRTC is like the right entity to take on this job, right? When it comes to the implementation of, let's say, surface-based robotics warfare or ground-based robotics warfare. I think in a lot of the work up to this point has sort of been focused on things like bomb diffusion tasks, IED neutralization tasks, and that kind of stuff. So it wouldn't surprise me that if in the long run the NRTC Heather and maybe some other UGVs sort of trend along these lines. I don't think we're far from seeing these getting configured and sent out for the insurgency front, because to operate them in that context, they just use a line of sight system. They might even try to use a beyond line of sight system through satellite communications with the Beidou SBAS architecture, see if they can operate them like, maybe they can like drop or send these UGVs in one area, have, maybe they're electrically powered. They get charged from a solar powered station, and then through satellite they would have an operator just send them out to sort of monitor these remote areas, look around, study it, and then come back and recharge and that kind of stuff. Maybe operate as a bit of like a first responder to low level insurgent activity, but alert the more, let's say, heavily equipped units like the loitering-munition units, or the whoever, like infantry, like air assault, what have you, give them time to basically mobilize and come in. But like the whole point being, if you notice that a lot of this is really built, you need network architecture, right? Like you need a network enabled warfare system. So I think they might start fielding it sooner at some capacity on the Western Front. Where it gets tricky on the Eastern Front is that environment is going to be dense with electronic warfare stuff, right? And definitely it's going to be dense with comms jamming and sat comms jamming. So it's very untenable that you're going to be able to use UGVs as they are today in that context. And obviously the Boston Army is not short of people, so I don't see them necessarily displacing human labor with UGVs, because at this point it's like human labor probably gets more done. Where it could potentially go off into a different direction completely is, and this would be like decades away from now, right? Where if the Pakistan Army wants to move away from supporting the pensions of millions and millions of service people who are retired, they might look into autonomous robotic warfighting like 40, 50 years down the line, right? When that becomes more realistic as a concept. Right. And that's when many other armies will probably be switching towards that anyways, right? So perhaps you can get into that, but that's just not, it's not a factor at this moment, right? At all. So that's my thought on the UGV stuff. I mean, just a quick TLDR basically of it is, I don't think we'll see mass deployment of these in the Pakistan Army's context, except for very specific tasks. And I think the problem that they solve for Pakistan is that they can give you a pretty good surveillance capability, reconnaissance capability, light response capability in very, very remote areas. But again, it depends on what kind of operating arc to develop around it. I think the NRTC project right now, I think it's still pretty early and immature where it should be. I think, if they're thinking in terms of optimal gains, it would be like a electrically powered, like a small EV that again would dock with a solar powered charging station, right? And then it would get sent out through get sent out, and a satcom enabled operator would be, viewing it basically and, using it essentially. So right now, everything else about it just seems it seems very limited in how much utilities can provide. Like an 8-kilometer line of sight. I mean, that's a scenario where I can see like an infantry unit using one for a very specific task, like maybe for reconnaissance, or maybe maybe to operate as like a quasi, forward observer type of situation, or to help them clear mines or an IED or something, but nothing to the degree of what we see in Ukraine. And the next question or topic is just a quick follow up to the transport helicopter decision or discussion. So, one of the questions I got by email as well is like, why doesn't Pakistan just develop its own helicopter then? If importing it's such a, like, why isn't that being taken as an opportunity given the state of the Pakistan Army Aviation Corps? So I mean, just a quick point, developing a helicopter from scratch for Pakistan is just not feasible. We just don't have the industry for it. However, we do have an option to collaborate with someone on it. So that the big someone would be Turkish Aerospace. They had basically promoted the T625 some years ago to Pakistan in various different ways. Right now, the Turkey is working towards indigenizing the T625 with with their own inputs, especially in the critical areas. They've also tested and certified their own indigenous engine, the TS1500. So and they're working towards integrating that to T625. So I imagine within a couple of years we'll see like a densely indigenized T625 variant. No acquisition of Pakistan would be serious until that helicopter is tested within Pakistan. So we have to wait and see for that. But that's on the T625 front. So, I mean, you could see from there a potential scenario where, if Pakistan shows interest in that platform, they could look at, potentially even trying to integrate the TS1500 to the T129 Atak if Leonardo allows it. Obviously, I don't think Leonardo would have necessarily an issue with that per se, because it doesn't really change anything for them. I mean, the engine was coming from a different third-party source, the US, now it's coming from a Turkish source. So it's more of like the additional R&D and the testing that has to go into it. But that's all contingent on whether the Pakistan Army Aviation still wants to operate in that 5 to 6 ton range, which is fine. But I think they might be more interested in something bigger, like 8 to 10 tons, because they just have, you look at the requirements. Like they have, the Hueys, the Bell 412s, they're the main, and the Pumas are the main 6-ton helicopters. But then they have the Mi-17s, which, to be fair, they're running. But again, we rely on Ukraine to run them, right? And again, it doesn't think people have to remember that, yes, we bought equipment from Russia, but the after sales support, maintenance, and all that is done out of license through Ukraine, right? In fact, very recently, Ukraine helped service those helicopters as well. And there's a time limit to how long that can happen, and these are obsolete helicopters, right? They need to go through some form of heavy, either like a midlife, it's like a service life extension program or something. And, that has to go back to the manufacturer. And we just don't have those relationships with Russia at this time. So who knows, that could change, but I'm just not sure where things are going with Army Aviation. And it kind of goes back to the bigger point, is that GHQ itself doesn't have a vision for Army Aviation. Like even the creation of Army Aviation as a core happened in response to the Puma acquisition, the Puma helicopters. And the Puma helicopters were acquired because the government of Pakistan was trying to get a reprocessing plant from France for their nuclear project. So they basically said, hey, we'll buy these helicopters from you if you can get this nuclear processing plant, or at least, get the other thing approved. So it was used as like cross leverage to push a different so basically there's like multiple layers of issues here, where the Pumas came as a byproduct of another program, and it was because the Pumas came that suddenly the Army Aviation was organized as a corps, right, in the late 70s. So when that's how the Army Aviation Corps was founded. And then you look at all of its growth periods when they inducted the Cobras, the Hueys, the Russian Mi-8s and Mi-17s, it all came on the back of either US aid or the vendor providing a pretty good deal in terms of financing, or they're just really small acquisitions, right? Like, for example, they in the late 70s, they ordered like 6 to 8 Mi-8 helicopters, right? More recently from Leonardo, they ordered like maybe 2 to 4 AW139s for VIP purposes. Like, so it's not a serious. Unfortunately, GHQ does not treat it as a serious asset right now. And it goes back to maybe part of it is that they just don't understand where Army Aviation sits. I think another part of it is that it's a bit of a lack of ambition, right? I feel, in my perspective, that Army Aviation has a huge potential role to play as the low altitude power. So basically, you have the Pakistan Air Force. They cover the high altitude segment, right? High altitude air power. Then you have Army Aviation working in the low altitude, doing somewhat comparable things. So, for example, in our Quwa Plus article a while back, recently we published it last week, it was basically we argued that, hey, like there's a scenario where you can use Army Aviation through the attack helicopters, transport helicopters, where they can sort of fire cruise missiles at low altitudes, right? So, for example, let's say you have a Pakistan Air Force or Army Rocket Force Command operation to neutralize a radar site or something. They target it, they think they hit it, they run a quick post-battle damage assessment through the satellite systems. They find out that they didn't completely neutralize the target. Maybe the helicopters are brought in right? To rapidly, again, fire another round of cruise missiles quickly, again, with another, let's say, going back to our earlier component of this podcast, where we're talking about low-cost surface-to-surface launch cruise missiles like the Crossbow. You do a combination of strikes and you use multiple different assets in different contexts to see if you can hit it, or from different axes, you can see to see if you can hit that target as quickly as possible before the Indians or the adversary adapts, right? That's the idea. That's where actually Ukraine is moving towards. So Ukraine, they've become famous for using, for example, FPV drones to shoot down Russian attack helicopters. But Ukraine itself is pursuing the AH-1Z Viper. Now you have to ask the question, why is that, right? Why are they? At one level, you could argue, well, didn't Ukraine just make the attack helicopter obsolete? Why are they pursuing it now? Well, the thing is that they're actually using it. They're planning to use attack helicopters for very different purposes. Obviously, it's not going to be close air support in the traditional sense. Obviously, these attack helicopters are going to will not be anywhere near the immediate threat environment where there are enemy FPVs and SAMs lurking about. Rather, it's to leverage the advantage of the helicopter in its inherent quality, right? Which is, being able to vertically take off and land, being able to leverage almost any type of, terrain to land and operate from, right? Being able to carry out nap of the earth operations. So, being able to hide behind hills and forests, that kind of stuff, or, to use the forest as or ground clutter as masking and that kind of thing. So the point being is that you can use the helicopters to sort of cover your low altitude segment to engage in more of those long range strikes and what have you, right? Through the right sort of munitions. And those are being developed in Pakistan as we speak. You could have a scenario where if you have a sufficient size attack helicopter where you can deploy something like the Uzab 250 cruise missile, for example, right? And that has a range of up to 350 kilometers. Let's say because you're launching at a lower altitude, it drops to 200 kilometers. Still, imagine an attack helicopter being able to target and engage, basically identify and engage its targets at 150 to 200 kilometers out, right? So that's the kind of capability that I think Army Aviation should look towards and sort of build around. And this is where you can have layers of advantages where, you can have conceivably a 8 to 10 ton transport utility platform, right? Something similar to the Chinese Z20 or the Turkish T925 or the Leonardo AW149, whichever is available and comes at a cost-effective price. And then you try to, procure a similarly sized attack helicopter that draws on as many common components like the engine, the rotor sets, the transmission or what have you. So you have some commonality between these platforms, and then you scale across that. So it's, right now the Army Aviation, they're operating 4 different utility transport platforms, basically, right? Of very comparable sizes, from 6 to 12, 13 tons. You can consolidate all that down to one 8 to 10 ton platform, right? And then build on that. So instead of having 30 helicopters there, 40 helicopters there, 20 over there, you have 100 of one type, and you sort of consolidate and standardize all your maintenance, your MRO capability, your logistics, your training, all around those types. And then you have a derivation, a variation of that based on the attack helicopter, where it's not going to be a 1-to-1. You're not going to get commonality to the same degree as, let's say, the Viper and the Venom, but you can have common engines, you can have common transmissions, you can have common avionics. So maybe even 30-40% commonality, which is still better than 0, right? So if, for example, in that context, between your attack helicopter and your transport helicopter, you have one engine MRO facility, right? Which then you can really invest in to sort of ensure that those engines are serviced for the full life properly, right? Maybe you can even start investing in some of the, the LRU production side, so you can source the spare parts domestically as well. That's one of the things, for example, the Mirage rebuild factory had, because the PF operates so many of these Mirage 3s and 5s, right? It had so many of the ATR engines that they're able to basically invest in manufacturing certain spare parts and components to keep those engines going for 60, 70 years almost, right? So that's the approach that you'd prefer to see the Army Aviation Corps take, but it really depends on GHQ, right? It's not I've actually met 1-star officers who've served with the Army Aviation Corps. And I think personally that they're some of the most visionary, best leaders out there in some respects, right? But it's not their call. They don't get to make the call here, right? This call goes right up to the Chief of Army Staff, the Field Marshal. And I hope that with the Chief, with the Commander of the Defense Forces role, that he takes a bit of ownership on this front and sort of it has this, holistic vision where maybe you could integrate Army Aviation as sort of a component that kind of works hand in hand with the PEF and Army Rocket Force Command to sort of achieve like strategic outcomes, right? For example, you could have the Army Aviation Corps organized to both support the light commando battalions for air assault operations, but also obviously special operations forces like SSG, right? Or maybe even the the Navy's special operations forces or the Air Force's ones, right? So it kind of it operates like as a bit of like a joint service office. So there's so many different things you can do. It's, you need someone to sort of sit down and envision it and commit towards it and have some have a bit of, I would say, self-belief, right? And not just sort of not just lose hope on these things and just say, well, we haven't figured out Army Aviation, we don't want to invest in it. I absolutely think there's a huge opportunity here because, let's just take the insurgency situation, for example, right? That's really typically where Army Aviation has always historically shown through. Well, why not build on that investment, right? Build on it. Build those dedicated air assault capabilities, right? Wouldn't you want to reach a point where if forward ISR systems like, forward deployed sensors like EO/ER systems or low level ground radars or what have you are able to pick up potential insurgent activity, right, emanating out of Afghanistan or whatever, that by the time those insurgents are big, before they're even able to mobilize and do anything at an outpost, an air assault unit is already on them within minutes. Wouldn't you want that capability, right? And then they're further backed up by Army Rocket Force Command launching low-cost cruise missiles at them, at those insurgents, right? Cutting them off from the back. And then you have, obviously, the air assault units going in and mopping up. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing you'd hope for. And again, it takes GHQ to sort of have that. The same vision they applied towards Army Rocket Force Command is now they need to apply the same assessment on the Army Aviation Corps. And I firmly believe Army Aviation Corps is not obsolete at all. It's just, it has another level. We just haven't found it yet. So that's all for this episode, everyone. I thank you again. And if you have any questions or things you would like me to discuss as like a solo cast, do let me know. Email us at contact@quwa.org or podcast@quwa.org, or even just my first name at quwa.org. You can use any one of those. And you can leave a comment here as well. We do read them all. And yeah, once again, I thank you all and take care and bye.